In 1956, MGM filmed 13 minutes of Forbidden Planet they never wanted you to see. Almost every cut had the same person in frame wearing the shortest skirts the Hays Code would tolerate. The studio buried that footage for 50 years, but the cuts were only the beginning. MGM also erased a composer, blacklisted 2 scorers, hid Shakespeare in plain sight, and treated their own masterpiece like recyclable furniture. And there is one scene the studio cut twice, 16 years apart, that you have still never seen the original version of. We will get to it. These are 16 facts about how MGM butchered Forbidden Planet. Number 16. The first thing MGM butchered was not the footage. It was the man who wrote the music. Before Forbidden Planet had its famous electronic score, it had a completely different one. The original score was a traditional orchestral piece, composed by a serious Hollywood composer named David Rose. Rose was hired in 1955. He wrote the score, he recorded the score, and in late December of that year, MGM studio head Dor Sherry fired him. Sherry had been on a Christmas trip to New York City when he ran into a married couple at a nightclub in Greenwich Village. The couple was Bibi and Louis Barron, and they were making bizarre electronic noises with vacuum tubes. Sherry hired them on the spot and threw David Rose's entire score in the garbage. Rose was so insulted that he went home and destroyed his own tapes. Every recording of his original Forbidden Planet score was burned by the man who wrote it. The only thing that survived was a few seconds in the theatrical trailer. That is the first thing MGM erased from their own movie. The man who replaced Rose was about to have his name removed too. Number 15. Bibi and Louis Barron made history. They composed the first fully electronic film score ever recorded. There was no orchestra and no instruments. There were only vacuum tubes that they built by hand, inspired by Norbert Wiener's book on cybernetics. It was the most groundbreaking work in the film. The day before the credits were locked, the American Federation of Musicians showed up at MGM with a problem. The Barons were not union members, and the Musicians Guild refused to recognize what they did as music. MGM caved. The credit, which originally read Electronic Music by Louis and Bibi Barron, got rewritten at the last possible moment. The final film says electronic tonalities, not music, tonalities. That word change cost them everything. It made the score ineligible for Academy Award consideration in both the Best Music and Best Sound Effects categories. The first fully electronic score in cinema history was disqualified from the Oscars because a union refused to call it music. The Barons were censored out of their own profession, and the worst part was still coming. Number 14. The C-57D, the flying saucer that lands on Altair 4 in the opening shot, took up an entire Culver City soundstage. The full-scale mock-up was roughly 170 feet wide, surrounded by a painted cyclorama of the Altair 4 desert that wrapped around the back wall. And the stage they emptied to make room for it was the same stage where they had filmed The Wizard of Oz in 1939. It gets stranger. The garden where Altair plays with her pet tiger was not built from scratch. The production reused pieces of the original Munchkin Village set from Oz. Dorothy's hometown was sitting in storage, and MGM rebuilt parts of it as an alien garden on a planet orbiting another star. MGM tore down Oz to build Forbidden Planet, and a decade later they tore down Forbidden Planet to make cheap television. The most expensive science fiction set in studio history was butchered for parts before the decade was over. Number 13. The original title was Fatal Planet. Irving Bloch and Alan Adler wrote the first version in 1952, and it was completely different from what you saw. The story was set on Mercury in the year 1976. The protagonist was named John Grant, the daughter was named Dorianne, and there were no Krell anywhere in the script. There was no monster from the id either. The invisible beast was just a generic Mercury native, and the title on the cover page said Fatal Planet. MGM killed it. Cyril Hume rewrote everything. Mercury became Altair 4, Dorianne became Altera, and the generic monster became a Freudian psychological horror created by the unconscious mind. Fatal Planet became Forbidden Planet because, quote, this was believed to have greater box office appeal. The word forbidden tested better than the word fatal. That tells you exactly what kind of movie MGM thought they were selling. They were not selling a death trap. They were selling something the audience wasn't supposed to see. And while they were busy rewriting the title for marketing, they were also hiding what the movie was actually based on. Number 12. Forbidden Planet is not a science fiction film. It is William Shakespeare's The Tempest, with the costume swapped. Morbius is Prospero, his daughter Altera is Miranda, and the monster is Caliban. Robby the Robot plays Ariel, and the screenwriter, Cyril Hume, did this on purpose. His first story outline from November 1952 already had the Tempest framework baked in. But here is the thing, MGM never told the audience. The marketing said nothing about Shakespeare. The posters said nothing about Shakespeare. The trailers said nothing about Shakespeare. Because in 1956, telling teenagers that the movie was based on a 400-year-old play was the fastest way to empty a theater. So the studio hid it. The London Evening Standard critic Alan Bryan figured it out on opening week and wrote that Hume had basically dressed the Tempest in spacesuits. The critics knew, the audience didn't. MGM censored the most interesting thing about their own movie because they thought it would scare people away. Number 11. The Krell underground machine, the giant power shafts, the alien laboratory, and the entire visual scale of Altair 4. None of that was supposed to exist on the budget MGM had approved. The art director was a man named Arthur Lonergan, working under production designer Cedric Gibbons. Lonergan looked at the budget MGM had allocated for sets, and he decided it was not enough. So he did something that should have gotten him fired. He started building the sets bigger than the budget allowed, without telling anyone. By the time the MGM accounting department realized what he was doing, the sets were already half built. According to the documentary Amazing, Lonergan had them about 50% constructed before budgeting caught on. At that point, MGM had two options. They could tear them down and start over, or finish them and eat the cost. They finished them, because the alternative was throwing away weeks of work and millions of dollars in partial construction. If the budget department had caught Lonergan 2 weeks earlier, the Krell underground machine would never have existed on screen. The most iconic alien set of the 1950s survived because one man timed his fraud perfectly. Before we get to the next one, if you are enjoying this, please like and hype this video. It helps the channel reach more people who grew up with these movies. Now, number 10. The monster from the Id is one of the most famous creatures in 1950s cinema. It is also the reason kids in several American states never saw the climax of the movie. The monster was animated by a man named Joshua Meador, who worked for Walt Disney. He was the head of Disney's special effects animation department, and MGM borrowed him. This was not a small deal. According to multiple sources, this was the first time in history that Walt Disney loaned out one of his animators to another studio. Disney was famously protective of his talent, and he did not share. But he made an exception for Forbidden Planet, and Meador spent months at MGM sketching the Id monster frame by frame on translucent vellum paper, photographing it, reversing the negative, and tinting it red. The result was so frightening that censors in several US states cut the monster out of prints shown to children. The studio's biggest visual triumph got literally scissored out of regional theaters because parents complained. Number 9. Commander John Adams, the heroic captain of the C-57D, was played by an actor who was completely terrified the entire shoot. His name was Leslie Nielsen. This was his second feature film and his first leading role. Years later, in a 1991 interview with Leonard Maltin, Nielsen explained why he played the role so stiffly. Quote, "I was so panicked at arriving at MGM, and that they were in fact going to discover at any moment that I had no talent, and were not only going to throw me out of the studio, but have me packed and shipped back to Canada." Nielsen called it his Donald Duck period. He was 29 years old, working opposite Walter Pidgeon, a two-time Oscar nominee at the end of a 40-year career. He was so intimidated he could barely deliver his lines naturally, and MGM, instead of helping him relax, used his stiffness as the character. The reason Commander Adams sounds robotic is not acting, it is fear. That fear got immortalized on film, and 24 years later, the same actor would use the exact same delivery to become the funniest man in Hollywood. Number 8. Robby the Robot cost $125,000 to build. That was about 7% of the entire film's budget. He cost more than most of the actors. He was designed by a man named Robert Kinoshita, who would later design the robot from Lost in Space, too. After the film came out, MGM treated Robby like a piece of office furniture. They rented him out to every cheap television show that wanted a robot. He appeared in 3 episodes of The Twilight Zone. He showed up in Lost in Space, going face-to-face with the robot his own designer had also built. He worked The Banana Splits, Mork and Mindy, Wonder Woman, Hazel, and Columbo. MGM had no idea what they had. They treated their most iconic prop like a rental car. Then, in November of 2017, the original Robby prop went up for auction at Bonhams in New York. The hammer dropped at $5,375,000. It was the most expensive movie prop ever sold at auction. MGM threw Robby in every show that called. He ended up worth more than the entire movie that made him. And one filmmaker watched MGM butcher Robby's legacy across 15 years of cheap television and decided to never let it happen to his own work. Number 7. Stanley Kubrick destroyed everything from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Every set, every prop, every blueprint, every model. He had it all incinerated after production wrapped. The reason he gave was Forbidden Planet. Kubrick had watched MGM spend years recycling Forbidden Planet's props across the cheapest television shows on the air. The C-57D spaceship became a Twilight Zone prop in the episode Death Ship. The crew uniforms showed up in Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Robby was everywhere. The Time Machine in 1960 used Forbidden Planet leftovers. So did Queen of Outer Space. So did The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Kubrick saw what happened to a great science fiction film when the studio refused to protect its assets, and he decided it would never happen to 2001. The most influential science fiction film of the 60s was made by a director who took the lesson of Forbidden Planet and applied it with a flamethrower. Now, here is the thing. There is one person MGM cut more than anyone else in their multiple reviews, and she was on the poster. Remember the scene we mentioned at the start? The one MGM cut twice, 16 years apart? It exists. But to understand why MGM cut Anne Francis so aggressively, you have to understand the loophole they built into the script before they ever cast her. Number 6. Cyril Hume's first story outline from November 1952. More than 2 years before cameras rolled, already described Altera the same way the final film does. She was a 19-year-old girl who had never seen a man other than her father. Anne Francis was 24 going on 25 during principal photography. The character was specifically written to be 5 years younger than the actress playing her, and specifically written to be sexually innocent. That was not an accident of casting. That was a marketing decision baked into the script years before Francis was hired. MGM wanted a woman who was old enough to look the part for the camera, and a character who was young enough that the audience would accept her in costumes a grown woman could not legally wear in 1956. The age gap between the actress and the character was the legal loophole, and once they had the loophole, they handed her to a costume designer who knew exactly what to do with it. Number 5. Helen Rose designed every costume Altera wears in the film. She made the skirts as short as the production code would allow. There was a white mini dress with red jewels, a black silver decorated mini dress, a pink one, and a blue hooded one. There was also a famous gold-beaded medallion dress that later sold at auction for $37,000. And several even more revealing designs survived only as sketches. The Hays office let her get away with it. The Spanish censors did not. Spain banned Forbidden Planet from theatrical release until 1967, specifically because of the costume. They considered Anne Francis's miniskirts indecent. For 11 years, an entire country could not legally watch this movie because of the wardrobe. And the studio that approved the wardrobe was the same studio that, in post-production, started cutting the scenes that showed the most of it. Number 4. There is a scene in Forbidden Planet where Altera goes swimming in an alien pool. Watch it carefully. She appears to be naked. She is not. She is wearing a flesh-colored swimsuit custom-made by Helen Rose to look invisible on camera. The wardrobe department's solution to the Hays Code was to tell the audience one thing visually and tell the censors something completely different on paper. The American version uses the flesh suit. The European version did not. There was a separate nude swim scene for Europe reel that Warner Brothers retained the camera negative for, according to film researcher Tom Weaver. 2 different versions of the same scene were shot, one designed to imply nudity and one designed to deliver it. You watch the implied version your entire life. The other one exists, sitting in a vault that Warner has never officially opened. That is the most documented example of MGM having one version for the audience and another version for the censors. And in 1972, they cut even more. Number 3. 16 years after the original release, MGM brought Forbidden Planet back into theaters as a children's matinee. To get the G rating the studio wanted, they had to cut more. According to Warner's own documentation, 6 additional minutes came out of the film for the 1972 release. Included in those cuts, quote, a 50s-style muted scene of Anne Francis, which made it seem she swam without a bathing suit. So the studio went back to the swimming pool sequence, the same sequence with the flesh-colored swimsuit, and cut even more of it out. The Hays Code version of 1956 was already a censored version of what they shot. The 1972 version was a censored version of the censored version. MGM cut Anne Francis twice, once in post-production for the production code, and again for a rating board 16 years later. They cut the same scenes and the same actress in 2 separate decades, 2 separate eras of someone in an office deciding she was too much. Number 2. Work prints are supposed to be destroyed. That is studio policy. Once a film is locked, the working version with all the deleted material gets burned to keep alternate cuts out of circulation. MGM's standard practice was to destroy them, but Forbidden Planet's work print was not destroyed. By accident, it survived in a vault for over 2 decades. In 1977, 21 years after the original release, someone at MGM discovered the print in storage. Inside were roughly 13 minutes of deleted scenes. There was Robby the Robot speaking in a completely different voice, an expanded swimming pool sequence, and a scene where Altera's pet tiger turns hostile to her right after she kisses Commander Adams for the first time. That last scene was a direct visual reference to the medieval legend of the unicorn and the virgin. The tiger only attacks her after she stops being innocent. The Criterion Collection released the work print material on Laserdisc in the early 1990s. The full restored version came out on the 50th anniversary DVD in 2006. 50 years after the original release, audiences finally got to see what MGM had cut. And the cut footage proved one thing very clearly. The movie they shot was not the movie they released. Number 1. Forbidden Planet was a commercial failure in 1956. MGM spent $1.9 million. They earned $1,530,000 in US theaters on initial release. That was a loss. The most ambitious science fiction film of the decade did not make back its budget. MGM's response was to bury it. The studio did not promote it on television. There was no theatrical re-release for 16 years. They reused its props on the cheapest shows on the air, and they licensed Robby to anyone who called. For over a decade, MGM acted like Forbidden Planet was an embarrassment. The film's reputation was rebuilt by fans, and by critics who watched it on late-night television in the 60s and 70s. Gene Roddenberry rebuilt it too, with a 1964 internal memo at Star Trek telling his production team to study the Forbidden Planet spaceship for ideas. The Library of Congress added Forbidden Planet to the National Film Registry in 2013. The studio that censored its costumes, fired its composer, hid its Shakespeare, blacklisted its scorers, cut its star twice, and buried its theatrical release as a failure is the same studio that owns one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. MGM did not understand what they had. They cut 13 minutes of their own masterpiece because they were afraid of the Hays Code. The studio recycled Robby until Kubrick burned his own sets in protest. And they cut Anne Francis once in 1956 and again in 1972. While they were doing all of that, they accidentally wrote the entire blueprint of every science fiction film that came after. Star Trek copied the uniforms. 2001 copied the scale. Lost in Space copied the robot. Star Wars copied the mythology. The version you saw on television is the version MGM chose to let survive. The version they filmed is still locked in a vault. And now you know why. If you like classic films that got butchered by their own studios, subscribe. I'm Bast with Just Iconic Rewinds. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.